energy to maintain a constant internal environment. So don't use energy to maintain a constant internal environment. So what that means is that their temperature is going to fluctuate. This is just one strategy, right? So if you don't have to use energy, then you don't have to acquire as much energy. So a good example of this is bony fish tend to be ectotherms. Although there is an example, I can't remember what it's called. They just found a fish that has these fleshy fins that it moves really quickly and it helps to heat up its body temperature. So its body temperature, it contracts its muscles to help regulate its body temperature. But in general, bony fish would be ectotherms. Amphibians like frogs, there's always the exception, and reptiles, except birds. And remember, there's some contention that some of the dinosaurs may have been endothermic, right? And so when we look at the birds and the mammals, they do use energy. So they are endothermic. So I'll just put ditto, ditto in that same sentence up above, right? So they use energy. So what this means is that it is a disadvantage because we have to get more energy from our environment. So whereas snakes, for example, can be really slow about their digestion, they can take their time and they don't have to eat all that frequently, and they have enough energy to survive. If you're looking at mammals, they have to eat all the time in order to regulate their internal environment, and as do birds. So these would be mammals and birds. So what do you think an advantage to being endothermic would be? The disadvantage is that it requires energy that you have to go out and use. What is an advantage to being endothermic? Right, and so maybe you could go out into new environments that are colder, right? So for example, you might be able to be more active in colder environments. So you may be able to survive the winter and remain active. And some mammals obviously hibernate, but a lot of mammals do not. So you're able to maintain activity even under cold conditions. So I don't want you to use the idea of warm versus cold blood. So if we look at this bass, which is a bony fish, has got the ray fin, it's a ray fin fish, it's a vertebrate, it has a jaw, so it's a jawed fish. If we look at it, its temperature can actually fluctuate with the environment, so it can be pretty warm-blooded, right, in the summer months. But when it comes down to here, its metabolism is going to slow way down, right? And then you can see that the river otter, which is obviously a mammal, is going to have a more constant body temperature. We actually have to maintain a constant body temperature because that's the way that our physiology works. So if our body temperature goes too high, for example, we could die from hyperthermia, or too low, we could die from hypothermia. So they're not really warm versus cold-blooded because you can have an ectotherm that is very warm-blooded if it's sitting in a hot environment, okay? So if we look at some adaptations, so adaptations are traits that allow organisms to survive in a particular environment. So I want to talk about adaptations to endothermy. So we talked about some examples of adaptations to a terrestrial lifestyle, like the amniotic egg. These would be adaptations to being an endotherm. So one example would be hair and feathers for insulation. right? So hair is able to trap air, and that air, so even if you're like a duck or you're a river otter, that hair actually traps air, warm air next to the skin, so that the skin isn't directly in contact with the water and constantly losing heat. And so it's insulative, so it's like downy feathers, for example. Another example is subcutaneous fat. So this is fat that is found underneath the skin. This is insulation. Other ectotherms have fat, but it's not underneath the skin. So like, for example, if you were to cut open a frog, a well-fed frog, you would find that it doesn't have any fat underneath its skin, but it stores fat in its abdominal cavity. The abdominal fat does not work with insulation, but it's a storage of energy, right? If you look at some reptiles, when they have a lot of energy, they store it in their tail. So their tail during the times of good food will be really thick, and then they'll get that out of their tail when they need that as energy. So it's not actually insulation. So other ectotherms have fat, it's just not subcutaneous fat, okay? We also have what is called brown fat. And brown fat is different from white fat in that it looks different because of its color. It has a chemical that's similar to hemoglobin in it, but its role is that it produces heat. So when we are first born, if you've ever been around a newborn baby, human baby, you'll notice that they do not shiver. And it's almost like they're radiating heat. And that is because newborns have lots of brown fat. So their fat is just using up energy and producing heat to help to regulate their body temperature. So they don't shiver like we do as adults. Now we have brown fat in our body. Generally it's up in the neck and the chest region, but we have a lot less brown fat as adults. Although it's believed that some people that have a high metabolic rate, so you might know some people that are like thin and they're constantly hot, right? They have a high metabolic rate. It could be that they have more brown fat. So they can burn calories to produce heat. And there's some evidence that you can adjust the amount of brown fat that you have by changing your environment. So for example, there was a lot of stuff in the media about it a few years ago, where if you turn the thermostat down in your house and you're kind of in a cool environment all the time, then you will have more brown fat and you'll actually produce your own heat. So it was kind of an interesting idea. If you were going to try to lose weight, if you wanted to lose weight, you could try to accumulate brown fat in that way. Okay. The other thing that that mammals have is what is called heterodont dentition. So this is versus homodont. So homodont, homo means same. So if you looked at the shark jaw in lab last week, you'll notice that all the teeth were identical. They don't really use their teeth to chew their food. They just use it to catch their food. So like fish have homodont dentition, they use it to catch it. Frogs have some homodont dentition. Snakes have homodont dentition, and they don't chew their food. So heterodont allows for better processing of the food. So it allows for mechanical digestion of the food. And this increases efficiency and speed of digestion. Right? So this is the idea that snakes just swallow their prey whole. And then if you force it, then you can actually get them to regurgitate their whole prey. So if you catch a snake and it looks like it's got a prey item, you can actually force the prey item to come back up in its mouth, and it'll all be one piece, right? And that's because they do not chew, and that's why it takes so long for them to digest, and they don't have to be really efficient at digesting. So we have to chew our food so we can get all the nutrients out of it and get it out quickly. So the food can move through our digestive tract much quicker. We also have a palate, a hard palate. And this separates the nasal cavity from the oral cavity. Now you saw in the fish that the nose, the nostrils didn't go anywhere. They do not breathe through their nostrils, but they use their nostrils to detect chemicals in the environment. So like to hone in on their the river through with which they came out so that they can migrate back to the same river, right? So we can actually chew and breathe at the same time. And that's important. If we're going to spend a lot of time chewing, we want to be able to breathe. And so if you look at frogs, for example, their nasal cavities go right into their mouth. And so anytime they have a piece of food in their mouth, it's going to inhibit their ability to chew, right? So this allows us to breathe and chew at the same time. Okay. So when we start talking about the circulatory system, we'll talk about adaptations to endothermy that help to get those nutrients to out to the body. So we'll talk about the four-chambered heart. So it is also believed to be an adaptation to being an endotherm in that only mammals and birds have a four-chambered heart. And so we'll talk more about that when we get to the circulatory system. So these are adaptations that you should know that are believed to be directly related to the evolution of endothermy. Okay, so today we're going to talk about the organization of the anatomy, the structure of the body. And so you'll remember that there's a hierarchy. And so we have cells, tissues, organs, systems, and then we have the organism. So we're talking about vertebrates here. Remember that sponges, for example, don't have tissues. So they stop at the cellular organization. Right? But even jellyfish have tissues. They have two tissue layers. And then all of the other animals have three tissue layers. Okay? And so when we're going to talk about the tissues, so these are groups of cells with a common structure and function. So there's people that study tissues, and the study of tissues is called histology. And I'm not sure why it's called histology, what that hist means, but that's what it's called. So you can take whole classes on just looking at the tissues. So we have four main categories. The first category is called epithelial tissue. And so I remembered this one by looking at the word epi. So epi means upon. And so that is kind of the outer layer. So this covers the outside of an organism, but it also lines the internal organs. So it covers the body. And in that case, it's called the epidermis. So our outer skin is the epidermis. And it lines organs. So it would be the lining of your esophagus, the lining of your stomach, the lining of your lung, the lining of your blood vessels. Everything is epithelial. Now also, all glands, so I'll put plus glands, right? So all the glands in your body, including your glands that produce hormones, but also like your salivary glands, the mammary glands, that is all epithelial in origin. So I just put this is just a squiggle. So I just put plus glands there. See if I get, maybe I'll put and glands. Okay. So if we look at the epithelial tissue, it is named in a variety of ways. So first is the shape of the cell. So squamous means flat. Columnar means column-shaped. And cuboidal means a cube. Those shapes are important. When we start talking about the flat, this allows for the movement of substances across the tissue. Right? So if it's flat, and we'll talk about if it's just a single layer. So if we are looking at our capillaries, we could talk about the movement of glucose, the movement of amino acids, the movement of oxygen and carbon dioxide across that surface, okay? Column-shaped tends to be absorption. So for example, we'll talk about the small intestine, which is lined by column-shaped cells. And the cells that line the kidney tubes, the kidney tubules, where we reabsorb and get rid of wastes, they're actually cuboidal. So in the image that I gave you, you can see that those different shapes. So on the handout that I gave you, so this is columnar. This would be squamous. This is actually stratified. The simple squamous is a single, and this would be the cuboidal, and they're pointing to the kidney, okay? So the shape is important, but also the number of layers. So I'll just put, we also name them upon the layers, okay? So if it's simple, like shown here in the lungs, it is, a single layer. Also in the kidney, these would be simple. Okay. If we look at the esophagus, so this is what delivers food from your mouth to your stomach, this esophagus has stratified. So this means many layers. And so it is actually stratified squamous epithelial tissue. So when we see stratified squamous epithelial tissue, this is protective. So it doesn't actually allow, in this case, substances to move through, right? So our outer skin is stratified. Our esophagus would be stratified. Our rectum would be stratified. Anytime there has to be friction and we need protection, generally that would be stratified. And then you'll notice that there is an example of a falsely stratified. So this is pseudo stratified. So that just means that it looks stratified, but it's not. The reason why this looks stratified is that the nucleus, which is purple, is in different levels of the cells. And so this would be the lining of the trachea. So that's what that's pointing to, is the trachea. Okay, so we're going to look at some of these tissues in lab, and so you need to be able to identify them and kind of know what their function is. Okay, so if we look at the gland component, we have glands that are unicellular. So that means that it is one cell. So the unicellular glands include what we call goblet cells. And these are really important because they produce mucus. So mucus is made from protein that is secreted, and then it mixes with water, and it makes something that is able to capture and also able to protect. So in the trachea, it captures debris. So that's in our respiratory system. It captures debris. So if we breathe in dust, it's going to get stuck in the mucus. And it's really interesting because the mucus is going to be moved up from the trachea. We cough up mucus and it moves that mucus constantly. Mucus constantly gets moved up, and then we swallow it, right? We did talk about a parasite that burrowed out from the lungs and then was coughed up and swallowed to get to the digestive tract with the mucus. What was that parasite that we talked about? Do you remember?
It was the ant one.
Wasn't the ant one. It's one that we have. It's the one that's associated with protecting you from autoimmune diseases and allergies. Hookworm, right? So the hookworm actually burrows out of the lungs and then gets coughed up with the mucus, okay? In the stomach, the mucus is protective. So that mucus is really important to prevent the stomach from self-digesting itself. So the acid in the stomach would just kill the lining and cause bleeding, and sometimes it does. But that bleeding and the gastric ulcers that cause it generally don't happen if the mucous membrane is intact. Right? So we'll talk about some things that can damage the mucous membrane and actually lead to ulcers in the stomach. So we also have multicellular glands. And these multicellular glands can be grouped into endocrine glands, endocrine, and these produce hormones. So hormones are chemicals that are released and travel via the circulatory system to where they're going to have their effect. So for example, thyroid hormone is released by your thyroid gland into your blood, and then it travels out to your body and it regulates metabolism everywhere, right? So how you're producing energy and regulating your metabolism. So this is lax ducts, and it uses the circulatory system to transport. Okay, so examples would be like the thyroid, okay, the adrenal glands on the top of the kidneys that produce adrenaline, and also the master control gland in your brain called the pituitary. The ovary and the testes, we'll talk about when we get to this, into the reproductive system. They also have part endocrine gland because they produce testosterone and estrogen. So this is as opposed to exocrine glands. Right? So these have ducts. They don't produce hormones, but they include, or they can produce, things like enzymes. So we'll just put don't produce hormones. So example are salivary glands. Salivary glands have ducts. So like you have salivary glands underneath your jawline, and then those ducts come into your mouth, and that's what produces the saliva. And the salivary glands produce enzymes and water and other stuff that, and antibodies actually even, that are secreted into your mouth. Sweat glands, mammary glands. What do you think lacrimal glands are? Has anybody ever heard of that word? That actually produces your tears. And your lacrimal glands are located above your eye. And so like sometimes if you cry a lot, your lacrimal glands will get swollen and your eyes will kind of like swell up and close. And that's because of the lacrimal glands. Right? So they produce the tears. And the tears actually drain from this, they're produced up here, and then they drain into this little opening in the corner of your eye, and they drain into your nose. And so that's also why you cry, you think you're producing snot, but it's actually tears that are being drained into your nasal cavity. Okay. So those are exocrine glands. Okay. So that's the epithelial tissue. The next group, so the second type of tissue, is connective tissue. And this is a very large, diverse group of tissues. So it is all derived from the same embryonic tissue, which is one of the reasons why they're all put together. But the connective tissue has cells in a matrix. Right? So that matrix generally is not cellular. It can be composed of protein, but it can also include minerals. So when we look at the connective tissue, this would include bones. This also includes cartilage. Okay. This includes tendons and ligaments. This includes fat. So fat can store energy as well as insulate the body, right? So we can break down, if we need to, we can break down that fat, and it is processed by the liver to produce energy. Okay, so that's a storage of energy. And then we also have things like blood. So you're like, how could that be connective tissue? But blood is made in the bone marrow, and it also has cells within a matrix. So what's the matrix that your like your red blood cells and your white blood cells, what are they found in? What would be what they're the non-living part component of blood? Anybody know what that's called? Plasma. Yes, plasma. So we have cells plus the plasma. Right? So you can separate out the cells and remove the cells, and then you have the blood plasma, which is the matrix. Right? So these are located in different places, and this is the other diagram that I gave you. And so we're going to look at these different types of connective tissue in lab today. I think I'll skip over that picture. Okay, so the third one is muscle tissue. So muscle tissue is very interesting because it is tissue that is capable of contracting. Right. So there's actually 3 different types of muscle tissue in your body. These include the skeletal muscle. So your muscles, like your bicep muscle, this structure right here is actually an organ. This muscle has muscle tissue, skeletal muscle in it, but it also has connective tissue. The tendons obviously connect the muscle to the bone, but it also has blood vessels and it has nerves that innervate it, that cause it to contract. And so when we're talking about skeletal muscle tissue, it is just the muscle cells, right? So a muscle is actually an organ. We'll talk about that in a little bit more detail later. So this is for movement. And it tends to be voluntary, right? So I can cause my body to move, like to walk across the room. But the nice thing about it is some of them tend to also rely upon reflexes. So all the little muscles that are keeping me upright are contracting and relaxing without me even thinking about it. And it also allows, when I shift my body weight, all kinds of things have to happen besides just the muscles that move my legs. So it has to keep me from falling down, and all of that can be unconscious. So even though it says voluntary, a lot of our movements, like the muscle movements that have to happen when I walk, a lot of that is unconscious. Okay. Then we have the smooth muscle. So this is like digestion. So when your stomach growls, it is contracting against emptiness, which is what makes the noise, right? So digestion, the bladder is also a smooth muscle. And one of the really interesting things about the bladder is it will contract involuntarily, and that's when you feel like you have to urinate. There's also a voluntary muscle that is the sphincter muscle that keeps you from urinating if you don't want to, consciously want to. So it's kind of interesting. The bladder will contract and you'll feel like you need to urinate, but if you do not urinate, then it will stop contracting and you'll go like, oh, I thought I had to go to the bathroom, but now I don't. You know, the kids in the trip, right? They're like, you had to go to the bathroom 5 minutes ago and now you don't, right? Well, in the next 5 minutes, they'll have to go to the bathroom again because it contracts and then you don't urinate, so it relaxes, but it's gonna contract again, right? And so that is the smooth muscle. Okay, and then also blood vessels. So your blood vessels can contract and relax, they can constrict and dilate, and that actually shunts blood to different parts of your body. So if I'm moving a muscle, the blood vessels to that muscle are gonna dilate so that more blood can go to those muscles to deliver oxygen and nutrients. Okay. So the third type of muscle so these tend to be involuntary. The third type of muscle is the cardiac muscle. So where do you think that is? What does cardiac mean? Heart. Right? The cardiac muscle is very interesting because it is the only type of muscle that can contract without nervous stimuli. So you can take one cardiac muscle cell and you can put it in a petri dish, and as long as it's got nutrients, it's going to contract. So individual cardiac muscle cells can contract in a petri dish. The other interesting thing about heart muscle is that some parts are really resilient. So like, for example, you could take a turtle heart out of its body and it will still contract. So it'll still be going like this, pumping. And actually to get it to stop pumping, you have to wait quite a while, like an hour, or you kind of have to cut it up into little pieces to keep it, and it'll eventually stop contracting. But turtle hearts are known for their resilient nature, being very strong-hearted. Yes.
So I thought the heart did have a pocket of.
It has some specialized, what they call nodal tissue, which are heart cells that, they're cardiac muscle cells that can cause an electrical signal to be produced. What I'm saying is that if you cut all the nerve supplies, so if you cut the nerves that go to that pacemaker, it will still contract on its own. Yes, so you're right. So the pacemaker is modified cardiac muscle cells that are self-excitable. Yep, good point. Okay. Okay, and then the fourth part, or the fourth type of tissue, number 4, is nervous tissue. And the nervous tissue includes neurons. And neurons are able to communicate using, primarily they use neurotransmitters to communicate from one cell to another. And they also have in the nervous tissue what are called glial cells. And these glial cells are called helper cells. So really, for every one neuron in your brain, there are actually 10 helper cells that are essentially providing an important environment, kind of regulating the environment, providing nutrients, and all kinds of other things. So in this particular example, the yellow is the neuron. This is a helper cell. This is called an astrocyte, and it is found in the brain. And it helps to regulate like the composition of the fluid around the neuron. And then you don't need to know these for the midterm, but oligodendrocyte actually insulates part of the neuron, so the electrical stimulus can be transmitted more quickly going from one nerve cell to another. So what we're finding is that these glial cells are really important, and they might hold the key to some neurological diseases like Alzheimer's. They also seem to be the key to understanding sleep, why sleep is so important. So when we sleep, it's believed that these cells, it kind of opens up the tissue, and these cells go in and are essentially cleaning up the nervous tissue while you're asleep, which kind of explains why sleep is something that we have to do in order to live, right? If you stop sleeping, you will die. Okay. So all of this kind of is designed around, all of our physiology is designed around a process that is called homeostasis. And this technically means the same state. So this means same state. Okay. However, what we thought was a constant internal environment, we now realize it's really important for that environment to fluctuate depending upon the needs. And so this is just the regulation of the internal environment. So temperature would be one example, right? And instead of homeostasis, we now have a new idea of what homeostasis means. Instead of same state, it is what is called a dynamic equilibrium. So what that means is that it's relatively constant, but it can adjust if need be. So it can respond to the environment. So some examples of this would be body temperature, blood pressure, glucose levels. Oops, I'll put blood glucose levels. Hormone levels. And lots more, so I'll put etc., right? So we know if our blood pressure is consistently way high, then that is going to start to cause damage to our organs, our blood vessels, and also to our kidney. And so we know that we want to maintain a relatively constant blood pressure. But if I'm exercising, I might want my blood pressure to be higher to get more blood out to my body, right? So my body temperature will also fluctuate when you're asleep. It tends to go down. So this happens to me every night. I go to bed and I'm freezing, right? And then in the middle of the night, I'm like hot. And that's because my body temperature, the set point, my thermostat of my body has changed. And so now my body temperature is lower, right? Also, after you eat, you might have experienced this, after you eat a big meal, your metabolism will actually go up and you will feel hot. Your body temperature actually goes up after a meal. Okay. Blood glucose levels, you want them to remain relatively constant. So you don't want to eat like Mountain Dew and a Snickers bar on an empty stomach, because that's going to just cause your blood glucose to go really high and put stress on the system. After you eat, you know, your blood glucose levels will be high for maybe an hour, but they should come back down to normal levels, right? So it's not really a same state, but rather it's this dynamic, so it fluctuates around a given optimal, right? Optimum. There's some fluctuation. So I'll just put. So it fluctuates depending on your body's needs. Okay. So we do have a mechanism that maintains homeostasis, and it is called a negative feedback mechanism. Now, negative, you don't want to think that this is a bad thing. I always get this on essay questions, like, oh, that's a really bad thing. It's because it's negative, right? It must be a bad thing. But actually, in this case, the negative feedback maintains homeostasis. So this is a good process, right? I'll put good process that maintains homeostasis. It's not a bad thing. Okay. So whatever we're looking at, we can talk about blood glucose levels. So we have a stimulus. And let's say you do take and drink a Mountain Dew after not eating, you're going to have high blood glucose. Right? This high blood glucose is going to be detected, right? And we have what is called a control center. So this is where we detect glucose, not where we detect it, sorry, the stimulus is an action potential that gets sent to the control center. So I don't want to put detect. I want to send, we'll just call it the control center. This is where we have the set point, right? So there's a certain level of glucose that you need to have in your body, and the control center regulates that set point, okay? And then in response, this is my response, it's going to send information or a stimulus out to an effector. And this is what causes the response. So the effectors always cause the response. So in this case, the control center is actually a gland, and it is the pancreas. And does anybody know what hormone the pancreas produces that regulates blood glucose levels? Insulin. So the pancreas produces insulin. This is a hormone. Insulin is a hormone that travels via the circulatory system, and it goes out to the liver. So insulin causes the liver to take up glucose and store it as glycogen. Okay. The liver can store glucose, so can your muscles. Your skeletal muscles can also store glucose to produce ATP. Okay? High blood glucose levels can be really bad for your brain, right? So they can actually cause you to go into a coma. As can, if you have low blood glucose levels, that can also cause you to lose consciousness and die. Right? And so the thing about this is that this response decreases the stimulus. So here I'm going to put response decreases stimulus. And this is the negative feedback. Right? So that's why it's negative, because it decreases the stimulus. Okay? So that's just an example of one negative feedback mechanism that helps to regulate glucose. There's another hormone, which we'll talk about, which is called glucagon, which has the reverse effects. So if your blood glucose levels go way too low, then the liver can actually release the stored glucose into the blood to keep you alive during those periods of time. Hello, are you ready?
I am.
Okay, I am done, I think, too. Okay, so we have a visitor to class who's just going to talk to you a little bit about registration. So I'm just going to stop here.